I'd started the hike early, just after 9 a.m., when the highlands seemed almost gentle. The sky was a stretched sheet of thin blue, the air still, the ridgelines open and clear. I'd done this route before, or at least parts of it, and I felt confident heading up toward the shoulder above Glen Coe. The trail was firm, the heather dry, and the light was the kind that made even the rock scree look warm. I told myself I would be back at the car by early evening, maybe even earlier if the weather held. By noon the sun was strong enough that I tied my jacket to my pack and kept going in just a base layer, breathing in that faint mineral smell the wind carried down from the peaks. Early spring in the highlands can turn in an instant, but I kept telling myself that late May usually gave you more time, more warning. Around 2 p.m., I noticed the first signs that things were changing. The shadows began to soften. The light lost its edge. A line of gray cloud drifted low across the western horizon, but it looked thin, the sort of thing that might just pass without trouble. I watched it for a moment, checked the map, checked my watch, and kept on. I still felt fine. The air cooled a little, which I didn't mind, and the wind picked up enough to hiss through the heather. I could still see everything around me. By 3 p.m., that changed. The cloud didn't drift overhead in a slow, predictable way. It arrived like a wall. One moment the ridges stood out clear, the next they were swallowed. I didn't see the line of rain approach so much as feel it hit my sleeves, then my neck, cold and sharp. I stopped to put on my jacket, but the wind had begun to push in sideways now, and I struggled to keep the map from whipping out of my hands. When I snapped the chest strap on my pack, I felt a heaviness settle in my stomach, that quiet recognition that I'd misjudged something fundamental. I turned downhill toward the valley, following the path I'd taken on previous trips, knowing that somewhere ahead, maybe 20 minutes if the terrain didn't slow me too much, there was a footbridge over a narrow burn. The map showed it clearly, a thin black line crossing the blue. If the burn rose too fast, that bridge would be the only safe place to get across. The slope here funneled water quickly, and I could already see small channels forming across the peat, pushing brown water around my boots. Visibility dropped fast. At first I could only see maybe 100 meters, then 50, then less than 20. The rain thickened into something like a curtain, steady and unforgiving. The air smelled of wet soil and bog grass, and soon I could hear the burn somewhere below me. Its usual soft rush deepened to something louder, rougher. The path became less distinct, softer underfoot, and soon I wasn't stepping on a trail so much as a vague line through the wet ground that felt right only because the alternatives looked worse. The first post appeared out of the mist so abruptly that I nearly walked straight into it. A square bit of timber, waist high, hammered into the bog with a number painted in red, 7. I didn't remember seeing numbered posts on this section before, and nothing on the OS map marked them. I wiped rain off my face, leaned close, stared at it for a second, and kept walking. I told myself it was probably part of some survey, erosion markers, or something left by a research group. It wasn't unusual in areas like this. I'd seen similar things elsewhere. Then came 8, maybe 10 meters farther on, the shape of it rising through the mist like a dull gray tooth. Then 9, then 10, all the same height, all driven deep enough into the peat to stand solid despite the wind. The numbers felt too close together to be trail markers. They weren't guiding anything. They simply existed, one after another, following a line I was already on. I tried not to read anything into it, but by the time I reached 11 I felt the ground sucking harder at my boots. Each step dropped me ankle deep, sometimes deeper if I wasn't careful. The rain hit with the dull pat of water on soaked earth, and the fog muted everything but the rushing burn, now louder and faster somewhere ahead. I paused at 12. The post leaned slightly, as if the ground had softened beneath it. The number had bled a little, the red paint streaking down the wood. I wiped my hands on my jacket, took a slow breath, and kept moving, though something in me wanted to turn around, climb back toward the ridge, even if the conditions were worse up there. But I knew that wasn't an option. I needed the bridge. I needed to keep going. When I reached the post marked 13, I stopped again. Not because of the number, but because something bright was caught in the peat at its base, half-buried, waterlogged, barely visible in the rain. A torn scrap of fluorescent yellow fabric, high-vis material. Next to it, pressed awkwardly into the mud, was a corner of a laminated card. I crouched, boots sinking deeper, and eased it out. The plastic was slick with rain and mud, and the name section had been scratched out with something sharp, jagged marks that cut across the letters until nothing was readable. The photo area was obscured with a thin layer of cloudy water trapped beneath the plastic. When I tilted it toward me, I saw my own face staring back, blurred, distorted, but unmistakably my features in the reflection. For one strange second my mind froze, trying to understand why my picture would be on this thing. Then I realized it wasn't a photo at all, just the reflection of my face in the water pooled under the plastic sheet. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. My fingers trembled slightly from the cold as I wiped the card against my jacket. The photo underneath was ruined, faded, water-soaked, unidentifiable. It could have belonged to anyone. Then I heard the splash. A single, heavy one. Directly behind me. Not the light slap of rain on puddles. Not the distant surge of the burn. This was sharper. Something stepping down hard into wet ground, or something shifting its weight. I didn't turn right away. My spine locked itself rigid. I listened, breath held tight in my chest. Rain pattered on my hood. Wind brushed the peat. Nothing else moved. When I finally turned my head, there was only the fog behind me, thick and colorless, hiding the slope above. I stood there longer than I should have, heart hammering, feeling the bog pull at my boots. The splash could have been anything. A piece of ground giving way. A dislodged stone. A deer startled by my movement. The highlands were full of them, and in bad weather they moved unpredictably. I told myself that twice, then a third time, until I believed it enough to start walking again. The posts continued, 14, 15, 16, though I kept my eyes mostly on the ground now, watching the water pool and swirl around my steps. The wind shifted and carried a colder scent with it, the smell of rushing, fuller water. The burn was close. I could hear it clearly now, running faster than I'd ever heard it on this route. The rain hammered the surface with a relentless hiss. I moved toward the sound, trusting my memory of the landscape more than my eyes, because the fog had closed in to barely more than a few meters. When I finally reached the edge of the burn, I felt the temperature drop. The water churned in a thick, brown torrent, swollen from the sudden storm. I scanned right and left, searching for the silhouette of the footbridge. At first I saw nothing but mist. Then the vague shape of the rail appeared, slanted slightly, the left side sitting lower than I remembered. It looked narrower too, or maybe that was just the fog playing tricks. I approached carefully, testing each step. The posts had disappeared somewhere behind me. I wasn't sure if they stopped or if I simply veered away from their line. When I reached the bridge, I placed one hand on the cold metal rail. It held firm. The boards beneath looked soaked but intact, though water slapped the bottom with force. I knew I had no choice but to cross. The burn would only rise higher. I stepped onto the bridge slowly, shifting my weight a little at a time. The structure creaked but stayed solid. The rain streamed off the hood of my jacket. Halfway across, I felt the bridge shudder, not collapse, not shift dramatically, just a brief, sharp tremor through the metal and wood. It could have been the current hitting the supports. It could have been wind. It could have been anything natural. I kept moving one step after another, until my boots hit gravel on the far bank. The relief was immediate and almost dizzying. The ground here was firmer, the slope gentler. The wind broke slightly against the hillside. I turned back briefly, watching the fog swallow the bridge again until it vanished completely. I told myself the splash I'd heard earlier was nothing more than an animal startled into the bog. The torn jacket and scratched ID could have been from a lost hiker months ago, carried by water and found by chance. The numbered posts were likely part of a research grid, simple, practical, nothing mysterious at all. I kept walking until the valley floor opened up below me, greener and clearer as the rain began to ease. Hours later, when I reached my car, soaked and exhausted, I sat in the driver's seat with my hands still trembling slightly. The heater blasted warm air across my face, and gradually the last of the cold left my fingers. The map on the passenger seat lay open to the section I'd crossed. I traced the burn with my finger, found the bridge exactly where it should be, and closed the map again. Everything had an explanation. The weather, the splash, the ruined ID, the numbered posts. The mind reacts strangely in sudden isolation and worsening conditions. It fills in blanks too quickly. Still, when I drove away from Glen Coe that evening, I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something in the fog rising behind the car, something moving in the rain-drenched valley I had just crossed. I didn't, of course. All I saw was the soft gray of the storm receding into the distance. Even so, for weeks afterward, whenever I thought of the moment at Post 13, I could still feel the weight of that single splash echoing behind me, deep and heavy, as if something had stepped forward just once before stopping completely. On October 2nd, 2022, just before midnight, I was moving slowly along a narrow stretch of the long trail near Mount Mansfield, my legs stiff from a day of climbing wet scrambles and stepping around muddy sinkholes that kept collapsing under my boots. I had pushed too hard earlier, wasting daylight on a lookout that wasn't even on my route, and now I was paying for it. The temperature had dropped to the mid-30s, and every rock was coated in a thin film of half-frozen mud that shone whenever my headlamp swept across it. Each breath hung in front of me in a pale, floating cloud. The beam of the light cut only a small tunnel through the trees, and everything outside that cone was just a thick mass of black trunks and dripping branches. The trail there was narrow with steep banks on both sides, the left rising into dense spruce, and the right falling sharply toward a ravine full of deadfall and mossed-over boulders. The wind barely made it down into that cut, so the air felt still and muffled, like a shut room. My pack straps creaked every time I shifted. I kept glancing at my phone's GPS, even though I knew the signal was unreliable, trying to reassure myself that the shelter I'd reserved was actually close. Half a mile felt reasonable on the screen. On the trail in the cold, on slick footing, it felt like a bad decision stretching itself out minute by minute. Somewhere along that stretch, the mud changed. Instead of the usual shallow depressions from other hikers, I began seeing prints that looked newer. They were set deep in the wet leaves and carried little pools of water in the tread. My headlamp caught the edges of them sharply, as if they'd been made only moments earlier. That alone wasn't strange. People night hiked all the time, but these prints were spaced wrong. Each one was at least 3 feet from the next, a distance that looked less like walking and more like someone striding with deliberate, exaggerated effort. The tread was faint, not aggressive like the trail runners most hikers wore, but more like an old work boot, uncomplicated, shallow, worn down at the heel. I paused over one of them and crouched, feeling the cold of the leaves through my gloves. The water in the impression still quivered from the breeze I created by kneeling, which made me feel suddenly aware of how alone I was on that ridge. I kept moving, following the prints because I had no choice. They were directly on the trail, and the trail itself was barely wide enough for a sidestep. Every few steps, the boot marks smeared out. The leaves were brushed forward, creating a streak as if the person had slipped, caught themselves, and kept going without fully falling. The smears were long, too long for a simple stumble. They looked like someone dragging their foot forward while trying not to lose balance. I found myself adjusting my pace unconsciously, matching the size of the steps ahead of me, as if doing so might help me understand the stride. Each time I tried, I felt my legs stretch too far, pulling at my hips. Whoever made those prints had either been incredibly tall or taking unnaturally long steps on purpose. The silence made the whole thing worse. No insects, no distant road noise. Even the occasional drip of condensed mist from branches seemed too soft. My own boots sounded loud, louder than they should have, crunching through damp leaves. Every time I stopped to get my bearings, the entire forest seemed to hold its breath with me. I kept glancing behind, even though I knew no one was there. The beam of my headlamp swung between close tree trunks, damp bark shining like wet skin. A little farther on, the prints became erratic. The stride lengthened for several yards, the smears grew heavier, and then the impressions suddenly straightened again, as if whoever it was had regained control and continued with renewed purpose. My pulse thumped noticeably under the straps of my pack. I tried to come up with simple explanations. Maybe a trail runner trying to make good time. Maybe someone carrying a heavy load that forced long steps. Maybe someone cold and rushing for shelter just like me. It was all completely reasonable, but the details didn't sit right. The worn boot treads, the inconsistent stride, the smears that looked like unsteady dragging rather than speed. About half a mile out from the shelter marker on my map, the print suddenly ended. There was no fork in the trail, no rocks large enough for someone to climb onto and jump off from. The tread just stopped in the middle of a straight stretch of path bordered by thick fir on both sides. The last clear heel mark sat at a slight angle on the right edge of the trail, the weight distribution showing more pressure on the outer side. From that heel, a long drag mark curved off into the leaves, sliding down the slope toward the dark mass of undergrowth. It wasn't a clean fall pattern. It looked like someone losing footing and being pulled sideways while still upright for a moment. The leaves were scraped down to the damp soil beneath, and the drag trail was narrow and consistent, as if the person's foot had been caught on something while the rest of their body was forced forward. I stood there for a long time, longer than made sense in that cold. My headlamp beam followed the drag as far as it could, but the ground dropped steeply. Beyond a certain point, the mark faded into a tangle of roots. I couldn't see any further sign of disturbance, no snapped branches, no gouges in the soil, nothing that suggested where the person had gone. It was just an abrupt end to a series of hurried, unsteady movements. For several minutes, I felt something like the pressure of an oncoming storm settle over me. An instinctive weight, not fear exactly, but a recognition that I was standing somewhere I shouldn't linger. The air seemed colder at that spot, or maybe I had finally stopped moving long enough for the chill to soak through my jacket. I tightened the straps of my pack and forced myself to keep walking toward the shelter. My shoulders felt wrong, as if someone had placed a hand on the back of my pack and removed it just as quickly. It was only the drop in temperature and my own exhaustion, but the sensation stayed with me. When I finally reached the shelter, it was empty despite being reserved by 2 other hikers besides me. Their names were in the logbook, written earlier that afternoon. No note about heading elsewhere. No sign they'd come or gone. Their bunks were undisturbed, the boards dry. I checked the area around the shelter for additional tracks, circling it slowly under the beam of my headlamp. All I found were faint prints from days earlier, softened by rain. Nothing fresh. No work boot tread. Inside the shelter, I dropped my pack, sat on the edge of the wooden platform, and tried to warm my hands by rubbing them together. I replayed the entire section of trail, from the first print to the drag mark, and tried to force a simple explanation to stick. The only one that made sense was the least satisfying. Someone ahead of me had slipped badly, slid off the trail into the slope below, and walked away along the ravine floor, where I couldn't see their tracks from above. Maybe they'd cut through the forest to avoid climbing back up the muddy bank, eventually reconnecting with the trail farther south. That kind of thing happened all the time in rough terrain. People made split-second decisions, especially in the cold. I resolved to check the logbook in the morning to see if anyone had recorded a fall or an off-trail detour. When dawn came, the signature pages were unchanged. No new entries. No one had come through during the night. I stepped outside and scanned the trail in both directions. The mud had frozen overnight, making new prints easy to spot, but there were none except my own. In the daylight, the drag mark on the trail looked less dramatic, just a long scrape of leaves disturbed by someone who'd lost balance and stepped off the path to steady themselves. The slope below was steep but manageable. A determined hiker could easily descend, cut through the trees, and rejoin the trail where it flattened out. It was simple, explainable, ordinary. But I couldn't shake the image of those prints stretching out in long, strained intervals, each one showing weight unevenly distributed, as if the person had been fighting their own body for control. When I hiked out later that morning, I moved quickly, trying not to think about how fresh those prints had looked in the cold midnight air, or why they had stopped so abruptly. The trail felt different in daylight, open, harmless, almost friendly, but the memory of that final drag mark stayed with me. It was the kind of detail that seemed small until I walked past it again, saw the slope it led into, and realized how far someone would have had to scramble in the dark to get back on track. By the time I reached the trailhead, I had convinced myself that nothing mysterious had happened at all. Someone had slipped, taken a bad step, and chosen a different route. It didn't matter that the stride made little sense, or that the shelter had been empty when it shouldn't have been. The simplest explanation was the only one worth holding on to. Still, whenever I think back to that cold section of trail, what I remember most vividly isn't the prints themselves, but the silence that followed them. The heavy, pressed-down quiet of the forest at midnight, and the way the drag line in the leaves seemed to vanish into a place my headlamp couldn't touch. On July 11th, 2020, at 6:52 p.m., I was hiking down from near the summit of Mount Si after a long afternoon on the trail. The air had that late summer stillness where the heat hangs low between the trees, and the light had shifted into a warmer tone that made the dust on my boots look almost orange. The upper sections of the trail had been crowded on the way up, full of families and weekend hikers stopping every few minutes for photos. By the time I turned around to head back, most of them had already filtered down to the parking lot. The trail felt hollowed out, like the noise had drained from it. I realized at some point that I hadn't passed another person in at least 20 minutes, which was unusual for that area. The forest around the upper mile of Mount Si is dense in a way that feels architectural, tall firs spaced like pillars, moss wrapped around the bases, ferns filling the empty places between. The main trail is wide and well-packed, but the sides fall into steep brush. When I came around a bend and saw a small side path branching off, I almost walked right past it. The sign was weathered and greened at the edges. Unmaintained, use at own risk. I probably wouldn't have paid it any attention if it weren't for the shoe prints leading down it. Fresh ones. Deep heel impact, narrow midsole, diamond pattern tread like some trail runners use. I stood there longer than I should have, listening. The forest was in that transitional evening quiet when most of the birds had settled, but the insects hadn't yet begun their nighttime chorus. It made it harder to judge how close or far anything was. Curiosity nudged me forward. I had extra water, the weather was good, and the detour didn't look too long at first. The prints looked like a single person's, heading down confidently, not wandering or turning. The unmaintained path narrowed quickly, and the packed dirt gave way to loose gravel and exposed roots. Every step required a bit more attention. After about 5 minutes, the slope steepened. My calves felt the angle change immediately. I kept checking the prints without meaning to, registering how fresh they looked, how sharply the edges still held their shape. Whoever made them couldn't have been more than 15 or 20 minutes ahead of me. Around the 10-minute mark, the terrain changed again. The trees grew closer together, and the canopy shut out more of the sky. I noticed something strange before I understood what I was seeing. The prints continued, heading down the slope, but ahead of me they stopped abruptly, turned, and headed back up in the direction of the main trail. The tread matched exactly, same shoe, same depth. But the returning prints were all left-foot impressions. Every single one. I crouched instinctively, leaning on my knees as I looked closer. The spacing between them was normal, like whoever made them was walking at a steady pace. Nothing in the dirt suggested a struggle or a stumble. Just a clean sequence of left-foot prints going back up the trail. For a moment I tried to reason my way through it. Maybe the right-foot prints had landed on patches of rock or thicker roots. But the dirt here was soft, almost damp. It held shape easily. Even when I tested it with my own boot, the print came out clear. The person ahead of me should have left 2 rows of impressions. There was no sensible way around that. A faint breeze moved the tops of the firs, but down where I stood, the air stayed completely still. I realized I was holding my breath and exhaled slowly to steady myself. The tracks continued upward for maybe 10 yards, and then disappeared where the unmaintained path widened again. I scanned the ground for any sign of the missing right foot prints and found none. When I stood up, something caught my eye a little farther down the slope. A pale shape against the darker rock. I stepped carefully, testing the ground before committing my weight. The angle was just steep enough that sliding felt possible. As I approached the pale object, the shape clarified. A shoe. A trail runner with the same diamond pattern tread as the prints. It was sitting neatly on a flat rock, toe pointing up slope, laces tucked inside like someone had folded them gently rather than letting them dangle. The right shoe. The forest felt different in an instant, like a pressure change before a storm. I had the irrational sense of 100 unseen people holding their breath, watching from behind the trees. The silence grew weighted, thick enough that every tiny sound registered. A distant creak of branches. A single tapping noise that might have been a pine cone dropping, or something else entirely. My arms prickled. I didn't touch the shoe at first. I looked around, scanning the slope below and the trees to either side. The path here was barely a path at all, just a thin strip of disturbed ground threading between ferns. If the person who'd placed the shoe had gone farther down, there should have been disturbed soil or broken vegetation. But the ground beyond the rock looked undisturbed, coated with last year's needles and small stones. I felt a pull to turn back immediately, but logic fought to keep me steady. I told myself someone could have injured their foot, taken off the shoe, turned around, and hobbled back up. But that didn't explain the clean sequence of left foot prints, or why the shoe had been placed so neatly, or why there were no marks suggesting someone had moved unsteadily or with pain. I finally stepped close enough to look inside the shoe. Nothing unusual, just the dark fabric lining, a faint trace of dust. No blood, no torn material. The insole looked dry. If someone had injured themselves, it hadn't been enough to leave any trace here. The thought of someone deliberately removing only one shoe on a steep, rocky slope made even less sense, especially when the descent required more stability, not less. I straightened up and took a slow breath, trying to listen past the pressure in my ears. I couldn't hear anyone ahead or behind. The forest absorbed sound in that muffled way deep woods sometimes do. But even then I should have heard something. A footstep, a shifting branch, anything. Instead, the silence grew heavier, like a thick blanket pressed over the area. I took out my phone not because I expected service, but because holding it made me feel less alone. Predictably, the signal was zero. I turned on the flashlight and swept it around, the beam catching small flecks in the air, pollen or dust. The light made the shadows thicker and sharper. Every tree trunk suddenly looked like a figure standing still, shoulders squared. The rational part of me kept trying to assemble an explanation. Maybe someone playing a prank. Maybe a runner hiding off trail. Maybe I'd misread the prints somehow. But the longer I stayed there, the more I felt that staying was the wrong choice. Not unsafe in a dramatic way, just wrong, like a subtle instinctual warning you don't realize you're listening to until it tightens in your stomach. I backed up the slope slowly, watching the rock with the shoe until it slipped out of sight behind a bend in the brush. When I reached the section with the returning left foot prints, I followed them quietly, stepping off to the side so I didn't disturb them. They led all the way back to the point where they had originally diverged, then merged back into the main trail. The packed dirt of the main path had enough traffic that any signs beyond that were wiped clean. I didn't see another person until I reached the parking lot. An older couple loading trekking poles into the back of a Subaru. They glanced at me briefly, then went back to what they were doing. I sat in my car for a few minutes before turning the key. The forest up above felt strangely far away now, as if I'd stepped out of something enclosed. When I got home that night, I opened my pack to put everything away and noticed faint dust from the unmaintained trail on my water bottle and straps. The normal, everyday dirt of hiking. Nothing unusual. But when I closed my eyes, I kept picturing that single line of returning left foot prints. The neat shoe on the rock. The silent air that felt too full. The simplest explanation eventually settled in, though it took time to admit it to myself. Someone had gone down that trail intending to run or explore, gotten hurt or disoriented, and tried to head back. They might have removed the shoe because a blister or sprain made it painful, then balanced awkwardly or hopped, leaving only the left prints. They could have reached the main trail, past someone else, and gotten help without me ever knowing. The shoe left behind might have been intentional, or forgotten, or part of a rushed moment. But the part that stays with me isn't the puzzle of the prints. It's the moment when the forest felt full, not of threat but of attention, like the quiet had leaned closer. Not supernatural, not imagined, just the sharp awareness that comes when you realize how alone you are, and how easily small signs can pull at the mind. I know there was a real person behind those tracks. I know there was a real reason, even if I never learned it. But every so often, when I think about that evening, I picture the shoe exactly as I saw it. Placed with care, toe pointing up slope, waiting for someone who didn't come back the same way they went down. I started down from Plateau Point later than I should have, still feeling the heat of the day stuck to my skin long after the sun had dropped behind the canyon walls. I'd waited too long for the last streaks of orange to fade, thinking the headlamp in my pack made the timing harmless. The moment I left the overlook and rejoined the Bright Angel Trail, I knew I'd misjudged things. The canyon swallowed light fast, and each switchback held deep pockets of shadow that my lamp pushed back only a few yards at a time. The air felt thinner, like it always did in the canyon at night, and every step down the rocky grade reminded me how quickly attention could slip on tired legs. By the time I reached the steeper section above Indian Garden, it was fully dark. The sky overhead was huge and clean, scattered with stars that looked sharper than anything I'd ever seen over a city. The trail itself was a thin ribbon of dust and worn stone, only a few feet wide in places, with nothing between me and the drop except a rough edge of rock. The beam of my lamp shook a little because my hands were sweating, and the strap on my trekking pole kept sliding under my thumb. I kept checking the batteries despite knowing they'd been freshly charged. The canyon plays tricks like that. Every concern feels bigger when there's nothing around you except silence and a long way down. When I rounded a switchback and started descending the next, the light hit something pale on the ledge below. At first, I thought I was seeing a rock catching the beam, but the shape was too smooth, too upright. Someone was sitting on the edge of the next turn, cross-legged, back straight, facing the open void. The person's shoulders were narrow, and their clothes looked light in color, almost dusty. For a second, it seemed so out of place that my mind stalled, trying to make it fit into something normal. A hiker taking a break, someone watching the night sky, maybe a person who didn't realize how close they were to the drop. I slowed down, planting each foot carefully. My breath sounded harsh in my ears, bouncing off the canyon walls in a way that made me tense up even more. The wind felt colder when I got closer, the kind that slips through layers and lingers under the fabric. Something about the way the figure didn't shift or adjust, not even a small turn of the head, made the whole scene feel wrong. I wasn't used to seeing anyone still on that trail this late. Most hikers were already in camp or at the rim, and anyone who lingered usually had a flashlight waving around. As I kept descending, my light flickered, dimmed to a weak halo, then sputtered back to full brightness. It wasn't a normal fade. It was sharp, sudden, the way electronics act when something interferes with them, not when batteries run low. I felt my pulse jump a little. It's easy to feel foolish on trails like that, reacting to every minor issue as if it's a threat, but the canyon at night doesn't leave much room for comfort. A few steps later, the figure was still in the exact same position, but the edges of it seemed softer, as if dust or haze was hanging in the air between us. The light dimmed again, this time even weaker. I could barely see my boots. I stopped walking, tightening the strap on my pole and swallowing the dryness in my mouth. The canyon around me went almost black except for a faint glow on the rocks a foot ahead. I lifted the lamp, tapped the casing, twisted it, then held it still. The beam steadied, thin but usable, just enough to look back at the ledge. The person was gone. The spot where they had been sitting was empty, just bare rock with a few patches of sand. I turned my head up the trail behind me, then down again, expecting to see someone walking away or climbing down, but there was nothing. No movement, no shifting shadows. Only the steady wind and the sound of grit sliding under my boots. When I reached the spot, I saw scuff marks in the dust, the kind that looked like someone slid their heels forward or pushed off from a sitting position. 2 long arcs traced the edge of the ledge and disappeared over the side. I crouched and aimed the light downward. The beam didn't reach far. It just faded into the layered darkness of the canyon wall. But I didn't see a body, no loose stones freshly tumbled, nothing that suggested someone had fallen recently. I stood there longer than I should have, long enough that my knees started to ache from staying tense on uneven ground. The wind kept rising in small bursts, carrying the faint smell of juniper and the dry, mineral scent of the trail. My mind began running through possibilities in an automatic, practical way. Maybe someone had moved quickly when my light went dim. Maybe they had stepped onto a lower shelf out of sight. Maybe they had been resting and didn't want to interact with anyone. Odd behavior wasn't impossible to explain. Not really. People react strangely when they're tired or afraid of heights or overwhelmed by the dark. Still, something about the scuff marks bothered me. They weren't messy or scattered the way I'd expect if someone had stood up suddenly. They were clean, drawn almost parallel, like a deliberate push instead of a casual shift in position. I didn't want to think too hard about that. I forced myself to continue down the trail, keeping my lamp pointed slightly ahead and slightly to the side, so I wouldn't fixate on the drop. Every few minutes, I glanced back even though there was no reason to. The trail stayed empty the whole way to Indian Garden. When I reached the campground, a couple of tents had faint glows inside from headlamps or phones, and the sound of someone zipping a pack or rolling out a sleeping pad carried through the still air. The normal, human noise made the tension in my shoulders finally loosen. I stopped at the water spigot and splashed my face, letting the cold shock me out of the trail's lingering unease. A ranger wasn't on duty that late, so I didn't mention what I'd seen. It felt flimsy to describe anyway, just a pale figure sitting on a ledge, a flickering light, nothing tangible to point to. I set up my small bivvy near the designated area and lay on my back, watching the stars drift across the sky. Every time I closed my eyes, the image of the figure sitting perfectly still on that narrow edge returned. I tried to replace it with something ordinary, picturing a tired hiker resting after a long climb, maybe someone dealing with vertigo or nausea who didn't want company. It made more sense than anything else. People do foolish things when they're exhausted, and that trail takes the energy out of anyone who hikes it too late. The next morning, I went back up the same section of trail with full daylight on the canyon walls. The ledge looked smaller than I remembered, barely wide enough to sit comfortably. When I leaned over, I could see the shelf below, a narrow section of rock where someone could scramble down if they knew what they were doing. That explanation should have eased everything, but the scuff marks were still there, faint but clear, toe angles aligned toward open space. On my way back to the rim that afternoon, I kept thinking about how certain moments on trails stay with you not because they're dramatic, but because they leave questions that don't settle cleanly. What I saw didn't break any rules of nature or logic. A person had been sitting on a ledge. My light had flickered. When it steadied, the person was gone. The canyon has dozens of routes and hidden shelves. Anyone determined enough could disappear from view in seconds. But what stayed with me more than the figure or the scuff marks or the failing light was the absolute stillness. The way the shoulders never shifted, the spine never curved, the head never moved even a fraction. It was the stillness of someone so lost in their thoughts, or so worn down by them, that the rest of the world no longer registered. And that, more than anything supernatural, was what unsettled me. The canyon is vast and ancient and indifferent, but the human mind can make its own edges within it. I never reported the encounter because there was nothing to report. No missing person bulletin appeared in the days after. No news of anyone falling from that section of trail. Life continued in its usual rhythm, and the memory settled into something quiet and steady. Even now, when I think about it, the explanation feels simple enough. Someone sat too close to the edge, then climbed down to a lower shelf when they heard someone approaching. The flickering headlamp was just a battery glitch or dust in the contacts. The scuff marks were nothing unusual for a narrow trail used by thousands of people every year. Yet whenever I picture that pale figure sitting cross-legged in the dark, I still feel the same distant chill I felt that night. Not fear of the canyon, not fear of anything unnatural, just the awareness of how little we sometimes understand about the people we cross paths with, especially in places where silence is stronger than caution and where the edge is only a matter of inches. It was 3:27 in the afternoon on March 10th, 2023, though I only know the time because I had checked my phone just before stepping off the main Pacific Crest Trail. I had been planning to turn back toward Cajon Pass before the light started dropping behind the ridges, but a gust of wind came racing across the wide cut of the valley, whipping the power lines overhead hard enough to make them hum. The noise was sharp and metallic, vibrating through the dry air. I paused to listen, assuming that was all it was, and that was when I caught the faintest thread of another sound drifting up from the brush below the slope. At first it blended with the wind, so thin and broken I thought I imagined it. Then it came again, short and uneven, like someone trying to hold in sobs and failing. It reminded me of a kid who had run too far and was scared someone would hear them. I took a few steps off the trail, angling my ear toward the slope. The sobbing stopped entirely. I waited. The wind rasped over the chaparral, carrying the dusty scent of sun-baked stems and old leaves. Then the sound returned, sharper now, like whoever was making it had shifted closer to the shallow wash below. My phone map showed no side roads within 3 miles and no established campsites in that direction. There shouldn't have been anyone out there, at least not a child. The brush was thick and brittle, all dry stems that snapped under my boots. As soon as I moved toward the sound, it changed again, slipping away as if whoever was crying had scrambled 20 or 30 yards to my right. I wasn't sure whether to call out. Everything in me said to keep the noise down until I knew what I was walking into. I kept moving, following the rise and fall of the sobs the way you follow a flickering light in fog. Each time I thought I was nearly on top of it, it shifted again, always with the same odd distance, always just out of clear reach. The slope pushed me deeper than I intended to go. The original trail vanished behind a screen of manzanita and dead tumble, and the ground underfoot changed from a loose scattering of gravel to soft patches of dark soil. The air felt tighter there, like I had walked into a pocket of heat with no breeze at all. The power lines were still somewhere above me, but their hum was almost gone. Even the wind seemed to hesitate around that part of the hillside. I finally stepped into a small clearing where the brush opened around a flattish patch of pale sand. It looked like an old animal bed, or a place where someone had once sat long enough to smooth the ground. In the center was a blue children's backpack leaning carefully against a rock. It wasn't thrown there or dropped. It looked placed, almost lined up. The crying had stopped so abruptly, I felt my ears ring from the silence. I waited for some movement, some sign of a kid stepping out or running off, but nothing stirred. I bent slightly to look at the pack without touching it. The fabric was scuffed at the corners and faded from sun exposure, maybe from being out for days. The name patch on the front had been torn off, leaving behind the ghostly outline of letters as a rough glue shadow. A prickling spread across my back, the kind that makes you want to check every direction at once. The clearing felt too still, too deliberate. I didn't hear footsteps behind me, just the sense of someone standing close enough that I should have heard them long before they reached me. Then I became aware that a man was there, close enough that I could feel the slight disturbance of air behind my left shoulder. He spoke in a low, controlled way that made the hair on my neck lift. He didn't shout or whisper, he just said that I shouldn't have followed the sound. I didn't turn around right away. My body locked up completely. I kept my eyes on the backpack without focusing on it. My pulse was pounding so hard it blurred my hearing. When I finally managed to turn my head just enough to check the corner of my vision, I didn't see anything. No shoes, no shadow stretching across the sand, no movement in the brush. But the sense of someone being right there hadn't faded. It felt like a presence just outside the range of sight, waiting to see what I would do. I stepped back slowly, trying to angle toward a line of brush rather than turning my back fully on the clearing. The sand under my boots didn't make much noise. It was compacted, like it had been pressed down by weight recently. I kept expecting the man to step into view. He didn't. The air grew colder in that strange way that happens when adrenaline hits, tightening everything inside you. I didn't know if the man had ducked away, or if he'd never been visible in the first place, hidden deeper in the brush. When I reached the edge of the clearing, I slipped into the cover of the shrubs and moved as quietly as I could. I didn't run. Running felt like the exact thing that would give me away if someone was watching. I pushed through the tangle of branches with careful steps, following the incline uphill where I hoped I would reconnect with the main trail. I used the angle of the sunlight to get my bearings, and after a minute or two, I began to hear the distant hum of the power lines again. That steadier noise grounded me enough to focus. Halfway up the slope, I crouched and listened. For a few seconds, I heard nothing but the wind scraping against the stems. Then faintly I heard movement below, slow, intentional steps brushing against the dry brush. They weren't the panicked steps of a kid. They were paced and steady, as if someone was following the route I had taken into the clearing. I stayed down, barely breathing. The steps paused. Then there was another sound, not exactly footsteps, but something shifting weight carefully on the sandy ground of the clearing. I forced myself up the last stretch until my boot caught the edge of the real trail. When I broke onto the open path, the relief hit so hard I almost dropped to my knees. The wind was strong again up there, carrying a constant chord from the power lines that I welcomed like the sound of traffic after being too long in still woods. I walked fast without looking back. I didn't want to see if someone stepped out from the brush. When I reached Cajon Pass, I sat beside one of the concrete barriers near the road and tried to steady my breathing. Hikers came through now and then, chatting casually, unaware of anything strange happening just a few miles away. I pulled out my phone and looked up recent search and rescue reports, thinking maybe a missing kid's name might give context to the backpack, but there was nothing that matched. No nearby disappearances. I debated reporting what I found. The backpack alone might have been enough, but I didn't want to explain the rest, the moving cries, the man's quiet warning, the sense of someone watching from cover. It sounded like something that would be dismissed as a misunderstanding. In the end, I did file a report, keeping to the plain facts. I gave coordinates, described the backpack exactly, explained that I had heard crying, and found the area suspicious. 2 weeks later, a ranger called to follow up. They had gone to the clearing. The backpack was gone. There were footprints, though, one set matching my boot type, and another larger set that circled the clearing several times before heading downslope. The ranger didn't speculate and didn't ask questions beyond the basics. He simply said the area fit the pattern of an unofficial campsite used by someone who preferred not to be found. Ever since that afternoon, whenever wind hits overhead wires and makes that sharp humming whine, I feel the same cold weight settle behind my shoulder. It's the reminder that some noises on the trail are designed to pull you off the path, and some people count on curiosity more than anything else. I don't take side trails anymore, and I don't follow strange sounds. I learned that lesson too clearly in that clearing, with that pack waiting under the still air and the sense of a stranger standing just behind me, close enough to speak. I reached the trailhead outside Triberg later than I meant to, the kind of late where the light is still around but already slipping. The air had that damp chill that sits close to the ground in October, and the trees in the Black Forest seemed to hold it like a cold breath. Locals had told me the loop I planned to hike was simple, a tidy 2-hour circle with wide paths and clear signs. I trusted that, maybe too much. By the time I stepped onto the trail, The sun was already lowering behind the hills, leaving a dull orange glow along the tops of the pines. I figured I had enough time if I kept moving. The first part was easy, all open trunks and soft leaf litter. My boots made a steady rhythm on the path, and for a while the only sound was the creaking of tall spruce as they shifted under their own weight. The air smelled like wet bark and moss. I stopped once to pull on a thin fleece because the temperature dropped quickly once the sun slid into the trees. By around 5, I realized the forest was filling with fog. Not a gentle mist, but a thick, rolling presence that crawled between the trunks and swallowed whatever light remained. My Komoot app showed the path clearly enough, so I tried to ignore how the fog changed the shapes of the branches overhead. Every time I lifted the phone to check my progress, I expected to see I was close to halfway, but the distance seemed to shrink only in small, stubborn increments. Somewhere near the first bend, the trail became harder to read. The forest floor smoothed out, and the leaf cover looked the same in every direction. My phone buzzed, announcing I was off route, even though I had followed the curve exactly as marked on the map. I turned a slow circle, trying to match the app's orientation with the faint line of the trail, but everything looked washed out by drifting fog. I picked the most likely direction and walked until the app buzzed again. Off route. Recalculating. The screen pulsed with a new line each time, a tiny shift to the left or right, like it couldn't decide where the trail really was. The fog brightened under my phone's flashlight, filling the air with a pale, useless glare. It was around 6 when I noticed the tree. A spruce with a warped trunk that split into 2 perfectly matched stems a little above waist height, like a Y turned on its side. At first it struck me as interesting, a strange natural pattern worth remembering. I passed it, kept walking, watched the blue dot move forward on the map. The ground dipped gently, and I followed what felt like the continuation of the loop. 10 minutes later, the fog thickened even more. My light reflected so sharply off the moisture that I had to lower my phone to keep from feeling blinded. That was when I saw it again, the same warped spruce, the same twin trunk twisted in that same subtle lean. The bark even had the same strip of peeled wood on its right side, a pale stripe that caught my eye. I tried to convince myself that maybe I had circled slightly without noticing, the way people do when visibility drops. But I had walked in a straight line. I remembered the incline, the feel of the ground under my boots, the direction of my steps. I moved past the tree again, faster this time, forcing myself not to drift left or right. The air grew colder, and the fog settled low, brushing against my knees. I breathed through my nose, focusing on the smell of damp earth and old needles. After a few minutes, my phone chirped. No signal icon still hovered at the top, but a new notification slid over the map. It didn't come from any app one recognized, just a small gray box stating that a route had been detected. Unknown track 9. The map blinked once, and a new line appeared. A perfect loop, tight and narrow, encircling my blue dot like a ring drawn by someone with a steady hand. The perimeter closed in slowly, as if the line were narrowing with each step I took. My battery indicator glowed red at the top of the screen. 3%. I stood still, the fog drifting past like slow smoke. I wanted to screenshot it, but realized how pointless that would be if the phone died. The cold made my fingers stiff. My gloved hand shook just enough that the screen kept shifting its orientation. The dotted line pulsed again, recalculating, tightening further. That was when I heard it. A soft, heavy shift somewhere ahead of me, muted by fog but close enough that the movement pressed through the silence. Not a snap, not a cry, just weight repositioning on soft ground. My heart lifted into my throat, so fast it felt like choking. I knew there were boar in this region, and I knew how dangerous they could be when startled. I forced myself to breathe slowly, to stay still. The sound came again, a little farther to the left, like something pacing with a deliberate confidence. It never drew closer, never retreated, just hovered at a steady distance. Always ahead, no matter which direction I turned. I shut off the phone. The darkness thickened instantly. Without the sharp white glare of the flashlight, the forest swallowed most of what remained of the dim twilight. I didn't want to rely on the map anymore. Something about the shifting routes made me feel unsteady, as if I were being lured into a pattern I couldn't see. I slipped the phone into my pocket, tightened the straps of my pack, and told myself to move in one chosen direction and not stop. The ground under my boots changed as I walked. The soft layer of needles thinned out, giving way to patches of damp soil. Roots cut across the pathless floor, and I had to raise my knees higher to clear them. The fog pressed against my face like cold linen. My legs ached from tension as I kept my pace even. Every few steps I paused, listening for movement. The shifting weight ahead of me kept pace, staying just far enough away that I couldn't tell if it was animal or something else. Something larger, maybe a deer or even a person standing where the fog blurred everything into silhouettes. I angled slightly downhill, hoping to meet a stream or a wider trail. Most established loops in the Black Forest connect with side paths or roads. The trick was to keep moving with intention, not letting fear twist my sense of direction. I checked the slope beneath my boots, choosing to keep the decline to my right. That way I wouldn't wander in a circle. I tried to count steps between pauses, but lost track after the first few hundred. My breath fogged in front of me in short bursts. The forest smelled sharper now, like cold iron mixed with wet leaves. Eventually the fog began to thin. The shapes of trees emerged more clearly, and the ground felt firmer. I started seeing broader trunks, the kind that line established trails. When I reached a clearing, I nearly stumbled from relief. The space wasn't large, just an open patch of ground where grass pushed through the needles. On the far side, I saw a faint glint, metal catching the last scraps of daylight. I approached slowly, scanning the edges for movement. The heavy shifting sound had stopped at some point without me noticing. The silence was almost too complete, like the forest was holding its breath. I moved closer to the metal shape and recognized it as a trail marker nailed to a post. The paint was worn, but the arrow was clear enough, pointing toward a wider track just beyond the clearing. Stepping onto the main trail felt like stepping onto solid ground after hours of sinking mud. The wide path curved gently downhill, and even in the fading light I could see the compressed soil where countless hikers had passed. The relief that washed over me made my knees feel weak. The fog thinned even more as I descended, and by the time I reached the lower section of the loop, I could see the faint glow of lights from a distant house between the trees. I didn't stop walking until I stepped out onto the main road near the parking area. The air felt warmer there, open and calm. When I checked my phone, the battery was at 1%. The map showed my blue dot exactly where it should have been, as if nothing strange had happened. No sign of the unknown Track 9 route. No saved notification. Just the familiar layout of the region. I plugged the phone into the car charger and waited for the screen to brighten. When it did, I searched recent routes, recent alerts, system notifications. Nothing. It was as though the forest had decided to erase every trace of the confusion, leaving only the memory of that looping, tightening circle and the presence pacing just out of sight. I drove back to my lodging with the windows cracked, letting the cold air keep me awake. The trees along the road looked ordinary in the headlights, steady and unmoving. I kept thinking about the warped spruce with the twin trunk, how I had passed it twice even while walking straight. When I reached my room, I checked the hiking forums for details on the loop. Most people mentioned fog being difficult that time of year, and a few talked about GPS drift in dense parts of the forest. It made sense. Phones don't behave well under thick canopies, and fog can distort distance and depth. Animals move quietly and unpredictably. Everything I experienced had an explanation, one piece at a time. But even now, when I picture the map with that narrowing circle closing around my blue dot, my stomach tightens. I know it was a glitch. It had to be. And yet, during those moments in the fog, with my battery slipping away and something shifting in rhythm with my steps, the forest felt less like a place I was walking through, and more like a place I had wandered into by mistake, one that allowed me to leave only because I kept moving without looking back. It was 7:18 p.m. on August 3rd, 2021, somewhere between mile marker 11 and 12 on the McAfee Knob section of the Appalachian Trail. I remember the exact time because I had checked my phone, annoyed at how quickly the sky had shifted. 20 minutes earlier the woods had been warm and balanced, all gold light and long shadows. Then the tree line swallowed the sun, and everything dimmed faster than I expected. The color drained out of the trail in seconds, leaving only shapes pressed tightly together, darker than they should have been for an early August evening. I had been hiking alone all day, moving at an easy pace, pausing whenever something caught my eye. I told myself I still had enough time to make it down to the parking area before it got truly dark. I was wrong. The headlamp came out of my pack after I tripped on a route I should have seen. I clicked it on, and the narrow white beam cut through the dark like a tunnel. The surrounding trees, which had seemed inviting in daylight, now crowded the trail in a way that made me feel like I had stepped into someone else's space without permission. The air held some leftover warmth, but there was a stillness in it that made the sweat on my back feel colder than it should have. Everything smelled damp, old leaves, wet soil, and something faintly sweet I couldn't place. I tried to make up time, taking longer strides on the switchbacks, counting them out in my head the way people count steps when they want to feel in control. The headlamp bounced with each movement, catching little pairs of reflective dots in the brush. At first the dots were small and low to the ground, the size and height I recognized from countless night hikes, spiders, always watching from the safety of their webs. But then I noticed a pair that was higher, not above my head, but above my waist. Then another. The shine was steady, not the quick flicker of insects. I kept walking, telling myself they were probably deer or raccoons. The woods were full of animals that could stand or climb just high enough to make their eyes meet the level of my lamp. I repeated that idea with every pair of glimmers I saw, though my chest tightened a little more each time. About 10 minutes later, I heard the first soft crunch of leaves off to my right. It was faint enough I wondered if I'd imagined it. The trail surface itself was mostly packed dirt, but the ground cover beside it was a thick layer of last year's fallen leaves. Anything moving through that cover made noise. I listened for a moment, shining the beam toward where I thought the sound came from. The undergrowth soaked up the light like a sponge, revealing nothing but overlapping shadows. I started walking again, telling myself it had been a squirrel or a stray deer moving downhill. But the next crunch came when I took my second step. Then another when I took my third. Each one matched my pace almost perfectly, slightly offset like something trying to move quietly, but not quite managing it. I stopped. The woods stopped with me. No echo of movement, no scurry of an animal bounding away. Just stillness, heavy and waiting. I took one more cautious step forward. The leaves to my side crackled again, just one crisp sound, exactly as long as my own. The hair on my arms rose as if a cold wind had blown through the trees. I swept the flashlight beam back and forth, trying to catch anything, a shape, a flash of fur, a branch bending. I saw nothing, only the tall trunks arranged like pillars, and between them, the impression of deeper blackness that invited the mind to fill in details it shouldn't. I kept moving, faster than before, but trying not to seem frantic, even though there was no one to witness it. I focused on my breathing, on staying balanced, on not letting the beam shake. The reflective dots appeared again, far off to the left this time, 3 sets grouped unevenly. I tried not to look too long. The crunching kept pace a little behind me now, switching sides at the turns of the switchbacks. Every time I slowed, it slowed. Every time I lengthened my stride, it matched exactly. My hands started to sweat inside my pack straps. The longer I heard it, the harder it was to explain away. Deer didn't track people so cleanly. Bears were louder than this on dry leaves, and they rarely moved parallel for this long without making a grunt or huff. I knew all of that, yet I kept trying to patch together the simplest explanation, something natural and familiar. But the rhythm was too deliberate. At one sharp bend, where a cluster of rhododendrons pushed close to the path, the sound came from inside the leaves instead of behind them. A single shift of weight, a short slide of something brushing against stems. The headlamp glinted off something inside the tangle of greenery, but I only saw the shape of a curve, maybe a shoulder or an elbow, before it moved deeper into the brush. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't hear it run or crash away. The leaves barely moved. That was the moment I decided to turn off my light. It felt counterintuitive, but something in the back of my mind insisted that if I stopped making myself a beacon, I might understand where it truly was. I clicked the headlamp off, and the world vanished instantly. The darkness was total, the kind that erases depth and makes the air feel thicker. My eyes took long seconds to adjust, and even then I saw nothing but faint outlines where the sky broke through the canopy. Standing still in that blackness, I realized the forest had never been silent before. There were always subtle sounds, distant insects, leaves settling, birds shifting on branches. Now there was only the steady thump of my own heartbeat and the soft hiss of my breath. The quiet felt unnatural, as if the entire hillside were holding itself still to listen with me. The sound came again, not from the side this time, but from directly behind me. Not a full step, just a press of weight on leaves, followed by a slow release. Then a warm exhale brushed the back of my neck, unmistakable, gentle but close enough that the hairs along my spine rose in a straight line. I didn't turn around. I didn't look. Something in my body reacted faster than thought, and I bolted. The trail dipped sharply, and I nearly lost my footing in the first few seconds. I caught myself by grabbing the trunk of a tree, scraping bark into my palm, then pushed off and kept running. The darkness made the ground unpredictable. Rocks and roots appeared at the last moment, and I stumbled more than once, each time thinking I would fall and feel that breath on my neck again before I could stand. I turned the headlamp back on only when I realized I was veering off the trail. The moment the beam returned, the woods snapped into place, branches, stones, and the narrow dirt line that was my only path out. I didn't hear anything behind me for the first stretch, but I didn't trust the silence. My legs moved without rhythm, half running, half falling downhill. The smell of disturbed soil clung to the air where I slid on loose dirt. My lungs burned, and my shirt stuck to my back like a second skin. I caught myself on trees, on rocks, on anything that kept me upright as I descended. Only when the ground leveled out and the forest thinned into a more open stretch did I risk slowing down. I turned the light back toward the trail behind me. Nothing moved. The beam reached only so far before the trees swallowed it. I listened. No crunch of leaves, no exhale, no presence shifting its weight. Just the first faint chirps of insects returning, as if some invisible hold on the woods had been released. I kept walking until the hum of traffic from Route 311 finally reached my ears, a distant promise of safety. By the time I reached the parking lot, the last light of the sky had drained away. My hands shook as I opened my car door, and when I sat inside I realized how soaked I was with sweat. I waited a long time before starting the engine, watching the edge of the trail through the windshield, half expecting to see anyone step out. I didn't. No one came. The next morning, after a night of little sleep, I went online to check if there had been any wildlife warnings or recent sightings in the area. There had been none. I even reached out to a local ranger station, explaining that I'd heard something following me on the switchbacks. They told me the same thing I already knew. Deer don't shadow people like that, bears don't move that quietly, and the trail sees enough hikers that odd behavior from animals usually gets reported. What stuck with me most was the ranger's final comment, offered casually, but in a tone that implied experience. He said that sometimes people cut through the woods off-trail, taking unofficial paths or looking for shortcuts, and they can end up tracking behind hikers without meaning to. He'd had reports before, someone hearing footsteps, someone seeing a figure move away when spotted, someone feeling watched without understanding why. It was a simple explanation, the most grounded one available. It made sense on paper, neat and ordinary. But I have replayed that moment on the switchback many times, the moment when the breath touched the back of my neck through absolute darkness. I have tried to imagine a person stepping that close without a light, without brushing against a branch, without making more than a single press of leaves. I still can't picture it. I have returned to other parts of the Appalachians since then, but never to that section of the trail. I don't avoid it out of fear in the ordinary sense. It's something quieter than fear, a recognition that whatever was in those woods with me that night had understood the dark far better than I ever will.